I'm Dr. Orion Taraban, and this is PsycHacks, Better Living Through Psychology. And the topic of today's short talk is why women pick fights. So, this can be an exasperating phenomenon for a lot of the men out there, especially those in relationships. Why is it that your woman seems to create unnecessary difficulties? Why does she pick fights over small and insignificant things? Well, I'm here to explain to you why that might be the case. The key to understanding this phenomenon is appreciating that emotion is reinforcing. I didn't say positive emotion was reinforcing. I said emotion was reinforcing. Emotion of all kinds is reinforcing to women. You see this kind of response in children as well. For example, most children would rather experience negative attention than no attention at all. And this is what, in part, creates class clowns in grade school or rebellious teenagers and adolescents. They would rather experience a parent's annoyance or judgment or anger or even rejection than being functionally invisible to them. So emotion is reinforcing. That is, it's rewarding. With that in mind, we can also appreciate the truth of the converse. If all emotion is reinforcing, then it's not negative emotion that is punishing, it's the absence of emotion that is punishing. Indeed, one of the most difficult things for a woman to tolerate in a relationship is the absence of emotion. The absence of emotion is experienced by most women as punitive, as punishing. This is why, if you ever want a certain behavior to disappear, it's better to respond with a neutral, non-reinforcing reaction than to respond with anger or frustration. The more unemotional the response, the less likely the eliciting behavior will be repeated in the future. And this is because the absence of emotion is punishing. And this is where a lot of guys get into trouble, because men, in part due to their temperament and in part due to socialization, are generally not very emotionally expressive. What's more, a man isn't always prepared to engage with a woman more or less on demand. Sometimes he's tired. Sometimes he's preoccupied. Sometimes he just wants to be left alone. In fact, there seem to be some important gender differences in how men and women tend to respond to emotional stressors. Whereas women generally prefer to talk things out in order to feel better, men often prefer to withdraw into the bat cave to solve the problem. Men like to go inside, to isolate, to incubate, and to resolve the problem internally before emerging with a solution, or at least a plan of action. Of course, it would be very helpful for women to understand that when men are disinterested in interacting with them, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a problem with them. They just have a problem. It's occupying their attention, and they don't want to cope with the problem in the same way that women do. And indeed, it is probably in everyone's best interests if the man and the woman can gently avoid each other for a while the man goes through his process. Unfortunately, many women push harder for connection at these times, mostly because they are treating their men the way that they would like to be treated if they were in the same situation. And this typically creates an escalating crisis because when a woman attempts to interact with a man in this state, she is met with a relative absence of emotion as the man has begun to withdraw within himself. And this withdrawal will typically be experienced by the woman as punishing, especially if she tends to be more anxious or insecure. She might begin to worry that something is wrong, and now the man has a new problem on his hands that he didn't have before. Now, before I go any further, if you're liking what you're hearing, please consider sending this episode to someone who might benefit from its message, because it's word of mouth referrals like this that really help to make the channel grow. And you can also hit the thanks button and tip me in proportion to the value you feel you've received from this message. It's your donations that help to keep the lights on. I don't do corporate sponsorships or product placements, so I really count on your support, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. Now, when people are insecure or anxious, they tend to seek reassurance that everything is okay. And one of the ways that women can seek reassurance in relationships is by picking fights. I understand that from a masculine perspective, this sounds ridiculous. but there is actually some validity to this perspective. Namely, an angry response reassures that you still care. Allow me to explain. Back in the day, I got into a lot of trouble when I was a kid. Sometimes when I came home after getting up to no good, my dad would yell and scream and send me to my room and take away my privileges and so on. And it's like, that sucked. And my dad wasn't my favorite person in those moments. However, once or twice, I came home and told him what I got up to and braced myself from the worst, and nothing happened. He just kind of sat there, quiet and exhausted. And I asked him, well, aren't you going to punish me? And he just said, no, and turned away. And let me tell you, that's when I got really nervous. Like I got scared that I had crossed the line once and for all and I was going to be put up for adoption. Do you understand? My father's anger wasn't nearly as distressing as his lack of anger. Because when people can no longer be bothered to get angry, you can be fairly certain that the relationship is on its last legs. So if you're concerned that someone might be pulling away or someone might be looking for the door, one way to potentially seek reassurance of their continued commitment is to provoke their anger. Because in a way, you demonstrate that the other is still invested enough to respond emotionally. On the other hand, if you were to respond to these provocations with boredom or indifference, then her anxiety is likely going to go through the roof. And this explains the otherwise puzzling phenomenon that when a woman is out of sorts, picks a fight with you, and actually succeeds in making you angry, she feels better. I know every man out there has experienced this. She feels better. As soon as your woman succeeds in making you angry, it's like all of her own anxiety and uncertainty just evaporates, allowing her to go on her merry way. And since it generally takes men longer to return to emotional baseline than women, this leads to the psychotic experience of dealing with someone who just an hour ago was spiteful and aggressive and who is now sweet and playful and acting like nothing happened. This happens because your anger reassured her, which allowed her to move past her anxiety and insecurity. Now, do women do this consciously and intentionally? I'm sure that some of them do. However, I'm also sure that most of them don't. And that's because most people are not conscious and intentional. So if it's true of people, it's going to be true of women. That might not make the phenomenon any easier to navigate, though it could potentially help you men respond effectively if you believe that your woman isn't acting out of any particular malice. Though, of course, there are malicious women in the world. But it's better to start by giving her the benefit of the doubt and escalating appropriately than to proceed in the opposite direction. In a future episode, I'll discuss how to never fight with a woman. However, this is enough for today. What do you think? Does this fit with your own experience? Let me know in the comments below. And if you've gotten this far, you might as well like this episode and subscribe to this channel. You may also consider becoming a channel member with perks like the priority review of comments or booking a paid consultation. As always, thank you for listening.